But, talking about the terrible things, my wife, take my wife, please take her. No, really.
Television made these people household names, then, in some cases, made them disappear. Andy Kaufman was voted off Saturday Night Live. Joan Rivers was effectively exiled from The Tonight Show. The Smothers Brothers pushed political boundaries until CBS pulled their show. And Nat King Cole faced an even uglier reality. Advertisers were afraid to support a black television host. But those are only the beginning. From fabricated scandals and controversial remarks to censorship, misconduct, and explosive career-ending decisions, these 15 television stars discovered just how quickly fame can disappear. And number 15 became one of the most untouchable names in television history. Let's get into it. Number 1, Andy Kaufman. The performance artist who made reality impossible to define. Let me start with Andy Kaufman, because frankly, his story doesn't make sense unless you understand that nothing about Andy Kaufman was ever meant to make sense. He built his reputation on Saturday Night Live, and I do mean built it, as one of the strangest, most genuinely polarizing performers the show had ever cast. Week after week, he'd alternate between absurdist bits that went nowhere and confrontational stunts that left the studio audience sitting in complete silence, genuinely uncertain whether they were watching comedy or witnessing some sort of genuine psychological breakdown. The man made people deeply uncomfortable. That was the entire point. And for a while, NBC seemed comfortable with uncomfortable. By 1982, however, producer Dick Ebersol had reached his limit. He'd become convinced, or claimed he'd become convinced, that Kaufman's act had stopped being alienating in an artful way and had simply become alienating. Rather than simply removing him from the show, Ebersol orchestrated something genuinely bizarre, an elaborate, televised referendum. NBC set up 2 separate call-in numbers. Viewers could call one line to keep Andy on the show. They could call another to remove him permanently. And then, live on air, America got to vote on whether this man should ever appear on Saturday Night Live again. The result was decisive, brutal even. 595,544 votes to remove him, 169,186 to keep him. Cast member Gary Kroeger announced the results to the studio audience with the kind of solemnity usually reserved for eliminating someone from a competition show. Andy Kaufman would never appear on Saturday Night Live again. And here's the thing that defies logic. Kaufman actually honored it. He never returned. Not once. For the rest of his life. A man built an entire career on refusing to acknowledge that anything was real. And yet when faced with what might have been an elaborate hoax designed to remove him from the show, he treated it as absolutely genuine and walked away forever. The genuinely strange part, and this is where reality completely breaks down, is that the feud between Kaufman and Ebersol that supposedly led to this public referendum, most accounts suggest it was staged from the beginning, an elaborate piece of performance art that both men had apparently agreed to beforehand. A scripted bit within a scripted show. But once the actual votes came in against him, once the actual numbers proved he'd lost, everyone involved simply decided to honor the outcome as if it had been real all along. A scripted moment turned into a permanent career consequence nobody had fully anticipated when they set the machinery in motion. That's Andy Kaufman in a nutshell. A man so committed to blurring the line between reality and performance that he turned the line itself into genuine ambiguity. He died in 1984. He never returned to that show, and to this day, nobody's entirely certain whether the whole thing was what it appeared to be. Number 2, Joan Rivers. The woman who broke the wrong rule at the wrong time. Joan Rivers is the person I want to discuss next, because her story is not ambiguous. It's concrete, tragic, and it fundamentally reveals exactly how much power one man, even in an era we now consider progressive, could exercise over an entire career. Joan Rivers spent years as Johnny Carson's most trusted guest host on The Tonight Show. This wasn't a minor role. This was a position of genuine power. She was Carson's safety net, his fallback, the person he trusted enough to leave the desk in her hands. That position made her one of the most powerful women in American comedy. And it put her in line, everyone believed this, to potentially take over the desk herself someday. In 1986, Joan made a decision. Without telling Johnny Carson in advance, and this is the crucial bit, she accepted a $10 million deal from Fox to host her own competing late-night show. Overnight, she became the first woman to headline a major network late-night program. A milestone, a historic achievement. She found out secondhand that Carson knew. Rather than hearing it from Joan directly, he heard it from someone else. And when she finally called him herself, by her own account, he simply hung up the phone. He never spoke to her again, for the rest of his life. Now, understand what that meant in 1986. This wasn't social media, a brief controversy that would blow over in a week. This was a network executive with absolute control over who was and wasn't welcome on one of the most powerful platforms in America. NBC made something absolutely clear to every celebrity in television. If you appear on Joan Rivers' Fox show, you will not be welcome on The Tonight Show. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a declaration. Suddenly, Joan couldn't book major guests. Every name she approached came back with the same answer. They couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk offending Johnny Carson. Couldn't risk being banned from The Tonight Show desk. The show Joan Rivers hosted on Fox struggled catastrophically. Within a year, it was cancelled. That same year, her husband died by suicide. Not long afterward. For nearly 3 decades, Joan Rivers never set foot on The Tonight Show. Never. She remained in exile from the program that had made her career. She spent the 1990s and into the 2000s rebuilding from outside the system that had rejected her. Hosting on QVC, doing red carpet interviews, clawing her way back through sheer force of personality and relentless work ethic. She didn't return to that desk until 2014, after Johnny Carson had long since died and Jimmy Fallon had taken over. By then, an entire era of television had passed without her in it. And yet, and this is important, Joan Rivers never stopped working. She became one of the most recognizable people in entertainment despite having been effectively exiled from mainstream television for nearly 30 years. That tells you everything about her talent, and everything about how much damage one powerful man holding a grudge could genuinely do. Number 3. The Smothers Brothers. The comedians who said the wrong thing about war. The Smothers Brothers, Tom and Dick, hosted one of the most popular variety shows on American television in the late 1960s. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was genuinely beloved. Good ratings, strong audience, legitimately funny material. It became famous for something else entirely: constant, exhausting battles with CBS censors over political content. Specifically, content critical of the Vietnam War. This was 1967, 1968, 1969. The Vietnam War was dividing the country. Protests were erupting on college campuses. The culture was fracturing. And the Smothers Brothers kept pushing anti-war material on national television. CBS censors didn't like it. They'd pull segments. They'd demand rewrites. They'd remove entire episodes from the schedule, sometimes replacing them with reruns rather than allowing them to air as planned. It became a weekly negotiation between the brothers and an increasingly frustrated network. In April of 1969, CBS had enough. The network abruptly cancelled the show. The official reason they gave the press? The Smothers Brothers had failed to submit an episode in time for censor review. A technical violation. Behind the scenes, it was never about timing. CBS chief executive William Paley personally ordered the cancellation. He was simply exhausted by a show that kept pushing at what the network considered acceptable, that kept using prime time to question the war. that kept giving airtime to perspectives Paley believed were damaging the network's relationship with the administration. The Smothers Brothers sued CBS for breach of contract. They won. The network paid them roughly $900,000 in damages, a substantial sum in 1969. A legal victory that proved nothing in practical terms. The show was gone. It wasn't coming back. And the message NBC and CBS had sent to the entire industry was absolutely clear. Political comedy, critical of government policy, will not be tolerated. CBS immediately filled the vacant time slot with Hee Haw, a country variety show with considerably less political edge. To observers at the time, the replacement felt deliberate, a signal about which voices were welcome and which were not. Decades later, Tom Smothers spent years speaking publicly about the cancellation as a pivotal moment in television censorship. He became something of a voice for free expression in entertainment. And eventually, in a gesture that felt like vindication, CBS itself publicly apologized to the brothers. The network acknowledged that it had been wrong to cancel the show, that the censorship had been unjustified. It came far too late to save the show. But it came. Number 4. Nat King Cole, the performer no advertiser would touch. This one still sits with me, honestly. Nat King Cole didn't get banned because he did anything wrong. He got banned because of who he was. In 1956, Nat King Cole made television history. He became the first black performer to host his own network variety show on NBC, a genuinely groundbreaking moment. The network was willing to take that risk, to put him on prime time, to give him a platform. The show was good. Ratings were solid. Critical reception was positive. NBC had made the right call creatively. But Madison Avenue had other ideas. You see, sponsors wouldn't touch it. Major advertisers simply refused to fund the program. The reason wasn't hidden. They worried, openly, that Southern white audiences would boycott products associated with a black-hosted show. Rather than integrate their advertising portfolios, rather than risk a backlash from some portion of their customer base, they simply withdrew funding. And here's where NBC's commitment gets interesting. Most networks of that era would have pulled the show immediately, would have said the advertising market had spoken and moved on. NBC actually stood behind Cole longer than almost anyone else would have. They aired episodes without paid sponsorship. They essentially subsidized the show themselves rather than cancel it immediately. That was something. Eventually, though, it wasn't enough. It was Cole himself who made the decision to end the show in December of 1957. After over a year of fighting for sponsorship that simply never materialized, after watching the weekly struggle to find advertisers willing to associate with him, he decided it was time to step away. He summed it up for reporters with a single line that's been quoted for nearly 70 years. Madison Avenue, he said, was afraid of the dark. That was his explanation. Not that the show wasn't good enough, not that audiences didn't care. Madison Avenue was afraid. Nat King Cole was one of the most talented performers in American entertainment. He could sing, he could host, he had genuine star quality. What he didn't have was white skin, and in 1956, that meant that no amount of talent could overcome the financial reality that major corporations wouldn't risk offending the portion of their customer base that wasn't ready to see a black man on television. Guest stars who appeared during the show's run, major names willing to work for scale pay just to support what Cole was trying to accomplish, later described the entire experience as quietly heartbreaking. One of the more depressing chapters in early American television history. A genuinely talented, groundbreaking performer effectively shut out, not by his audience, but by an advertising industry unwilling to take any risk for him. Number 5. Morton Downey Jr., the shock jock who fabricated his own conspiracy. Morton Downey Jr. was a different breed entirely. He pioneered, and I want to be clear about this, he genuinely pioneered a specific style of talk show that would echo through decades of television, that came after him. Loud, aggressive, confrontational, built around screaming matches between guests and audience members, with Downey happily provoking every argument from his host chair. It was popular, absolutely. Audiences tuned in for the chaos. In the late 1980s, his show was genuinely successful. By the second season, though, the novelty was starting to wear thin. Ratings were fading. The shock value was becoming predictable. The show had nowhere left to go. In April of 1989, Downey emerged from a San Francisco airport bathroom with a swastika drawn on his face. He claimed he'd been attacked by neo-Nazis. He'd been brutalized. He had physical proof, the swastika carved across his face. The story exploded. Media coverage was massive. This was a television personality, a real personality, a real presence on cable, attacked by extremists. The narrative was sensational and horrifying. Police investigators looked into it immediately. They found no witnesses. They found no suspects. They found no one, in fact, who'd seen anything remotely close to what Downey described. More importantly, they found something else. The swastika had been drawn backward. Exactly, and I mean exactly, backward. The kind of backward you'd get if you drew it on your own face while looking in a mirror. Investigators concluded that Downey had drawn the swastika himself, that he'd fabricated the entire attack, that he'd lied about neo-Nazis brutalizing him in order to generate publicity for a show that was running out of material. His syndicated show was pulled by July of that same year. Officially, the network cited collapsing ratings and advertiser abandonment. Unofficially, there was no secret about what had actually finished him off. You don't fabricate an attack by neo-Nazis and then expect to keep your television career. Downey never regained anything close to his previous level of television prominence. He died in 2001, remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about manufactured outrage. But here's the genuinely strange historical footnote. Documentary filmmakers who revisited his career years later argued that Downey had essentially invented the template for a specific kind of talk show. Confrontational, ratings-driven, built around the conflict itself rather than actual content. Jerry Springer would build an empire on that exact template. Various cable news personalities would follow. Downey, in other words, pioneered a format that would eventually outlive and outgrow the man who created it. He just didn't survive long enough to see it succeed. Number 6. Lenny Bruce. The comedian too honest for his own time. Lenny Bruce built his reputation as one of the most influential stand-up comedians in American history. And I want to be absolutely precise about this. He was influential because he said things virtually no other performer of his era dared say on stage. Religion, race, sexuality, authority, all of it. Direct, unfiltered, absolutely fearless. That same fearlessness made him almost entirely unwelcome on network television throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. Most major shows refused to book him. The calculation was simple. His material triggered obscenity complaints from viewers and regulators. The risk wasn't worth it. The consequences escalated. Bruce was arrested on obscenity charges multiple times across the country, convicted in Chicago in 1963, convicted again in 1964, following performances in Greenwich Village. That conviction came with a 4-month jail sentence. By 1966, he'd been blacklisted from virtually every nightclub in America. Club owners weren't willing to risk their own obscenity prosecutions just to book him. He'd become radioactive, too expensive, legally, to keep around. Bruce died later that same year, largely shut out of both television and the club circuit that had made him famous. Free speech advocates held his story up as a cautionary tale about censorship in American entertainment. It became the reference point for everything that followed. A comedian persecuted for speech. Decades after his death, in 2003, New York's governor granted Bruce a posthumous pardon. a formal acknowledgement that his obscenity conviction represented a genuine miscarriage of justice. Not a legitimate criminal violation, but a genuine injustice in the system itself. Comedians who came after him, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, frequently credited Bruce with paving the way, with proving that you could tackle difficult subjects on stage, that the path was possible, even if Bruce himself hadn't survived to walk it comfortably. His legacy is complicated. He was persecuted, that's genuine. And he was also proven right, eventually, by the same legal system that had convicted him. Number 7. Chevy Chase. The cast member. Nobody wanted to work with Chevy Chase, was part of the original cast that made Saturday Night Live a cultural phenomenon in 1975. Genuinely one of the show's founding figures. He remained associated with SNL for decades, regularly returning as a guest host, remaining in the orbit of something he'd helped create. His relationship with the show soured dramatically after a 1997 hosting appearance. During a sketch rehearsal, Chase reportedly slapped cast member Chris Farley, hard enough that it became an immediate incident, an immediate problem, an immediate violation of whatever unspoken code governed the show. He was effectively banned from returning as a guest host after that. No formal announcement. No public statement, just a quiet message that Chase wouldn't be invited back. Over the years, he's made brief cameo appearances on the show. Producer Lorne Michaels has maintained, reportedly, significant reservations about inviting him back in any substantial capacity. The tension festered quietly until the show's 50th anniversary special in 2015. Chase was excluded from that retrospective entirely. A founding cast member, removed from the history of the show he'd helped create. He confronted Michaels directly about the snub, demanding to know why he wasn't included. Michaels's response was vague to the point of meaninglessness. Concerns had been raised about Chase's focus. That was his explanation. The underlying incident, the alleged slap, was never fully explained by Chase himself. He's never detailed his side of the story. Colleagues who've worked with him across various projects in the decades since describe a talented performer, also famously difficult. A pattern of conflict with co-stars and crew that followed him beyond SNL, resurfacing again during his later run on Community, where reported tensions with other cast members made headlines. That's the story of Chevy Chase, a founding cast member of one of the most important shows in television history, quietly exiled because of persistent difficulties with colleagues. Number 8. Phil Donahue, the host who asked the wrong questions at the wrong moment. Phil Donahue pioneered the modern daytime talk show format. Absolutely pioneered it. Long before Oprah Winfrey built an empire on the template, before Jerry Springer made chaos into an art form, Donahue created the entire blueprint: studio audience participation, audience questions, engagement, intimacy. He was the original. By the early 2000s, Donahue had moved into cable news. He was hosting a nightly program on MSNBC. By 2003, as the United States prepared to invade Iraq, his show was one of the network's highest-rated programs. Why? Because he was consistently featuring guests critical of the coming war. MSNBC cancelled the show. Officially, there was no stated reason. Unofficially, an internal network memo later leaked to the press explained everything. The memo described Donahue as a difficult public face for the network. Not difficult in terms of talent. He was delivering ratings. Difficult because his show could become what the memo explicitly called a home for anti-war voices, at a moment when NBC wanted the network to project unquestioning support for the war effort. It's one sentence that explains everything about how television functions as a political tool. The network chose to silence a popular, high-rated host because his editorial perspective didn't align with the network's political position. The cancellation became one of the most cited examples of a major news outlet removing a popular host, specifically over the political tone of his programming. Not for failing ratings, those were strong. Not for ethical violations. For editorial perspective. Donahue himself spent years speaking about the cancellation, arguing publicly that it represented exactly the chilling effect on dissenting political speech that a genuinely free press was supposed to prevent, particularly at a moment when the country was heading into a major military conflict. He never returned to a regular hosting role on a major network afterward. He shifted instead into documentary filmmaking, focusing on the human costs of that very war his show had been cancelled for questioning too openly. Number 9. Dan Rather, the anchor who became the scapegoat. Dan Rather anchored the CBS Evening News for nearly a quarter century. He became one of the most trusted and recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism. That's not hyperbole. For an entire generation, Rather was the voice of CBS News, the face of credibility. In September of 2004, Rather reported a story that would unravel everything. He questioned President George W. Bush's National Guard service record, basing the story on documents that were later shown to be of questionable authenticity. Not fabricated necessarily, questionable, potentially problematic, not sufficiently verified. It was a mistake, a genuine, significant mistake. CBS News launched an independent investigation into the reporting. Several producers were forced out. Rather himself was pressured to step down as anchor earlier than he'd planned. In 2005, after a quarter century at the desk, he departed CBS News. It was presented as his decision to move on. It wasn't. Rather later sued CBS, alleging that the network had made him a scapegoat, thrown him to the wolves, in order to protect its own corporate relationships with the administration. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and Rather never returned to a major broadcast network. Here's the interesting bit. Rather maintained for the rest of his career that the underlying story, the one about Bush's National Guard service, had substantial factual merit, regardless of whether those specific documents were authentic. The story, he argued, was right, even if the evidence was wrong. Years later, after digital journalism and social media emerged, Rather found a surprisingly robust second act. He became a widely followed political commentator, rebuilding a public following almost entirely independent of the network structure that had once defined his entire professional identity. Millions of people following him on social media, a direct audience engagement, a career rebuilt outside the institution that had exiled him. Number 10. Don Imus, the radio personality who said the unforgivable. Don Imus built a decades-long career as a radio shock jock. That was his brand. Provocative, aggressive, designed to offend and entertain through offense. His morning show was simulcast on MSNBC, giving him a genuine foothold in television as well as radio. In April of 2007, referring to the Rutgers University women's basketball team, a group of mostly black student athletes who'd just played in the national championship game, Imus used a racially and sexually degrading slur on air. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, both CBS Radio and MSNBC severed ties with him entirely. His simulcast was cancelled. He was fired from the platforms that had carried his voice for years. Imus issued a public apology. He met personally with members of the Rutgers team. Eventually, he returned to radio and a smaller cable outlet the following year. But he never regained the level of mainstream network visibility he'd held before the incident. A permanent professional consequence for a single, widely condemned remark. The Rutgers players themselves spoke publicly about the personal toll the comment took on them individually. What's worth noting, though, is that the national attention surrounding Imus's firing sometimes overshadowed their own accomplishment, their achievement of reaching the championship game. The story became about his downfall rather than their success. An uncomfortable dynamic in what was supposed to be a cautionary tale about accountability. Number 11. Roseanne Barr, the star erased from her own universe. Roseanne Barr starred in and produced one of the most successful sitcoms in television history. Roseanne was a genuine cultural phenomenon, a show about a working-class family that resonated with millions of viewers because it didn't pretend poverty was quaint or amusing. It was difficult, complex, real. Decades later, ABC revived the show. Audiences still wanted the Connor family. The reboot was popular. Strong ratings. In May of 2018, Barr posted a tweet about Valerie Jarrett, a former Obama administration official. The tweet compared her to a fictional ape-human hybrid character. It was racist, obviously racist, inexcusably racist. The backlash was immediate and severe. Within hours, genuinely within hours, ABC announced it was canceling the newly revived show entirely, not pausing it, not suspending it, canceling it permanently. This, despite strong ratings. Despite Barr being the title character and the driving creative force behind the entire program, ABC went further. They produced a spin-off called The Connors that continued the universe without her. They killed off her character entirely in the opening minutes of the new show's premiere, formally writing her out of the world she had created decades earlier, a deliberate erasure. Barr has not returned to a major broadcast network series since. By most industry accounts, she remains considered too much of a liability for any major network to risk associating with. She apologized publicly for the tweet afterward, attributing part of her lapse in judgment to a sleep medication she'd been taking. The manufacturer publicly disputed that explanation at the time. It didn't matter. Barr has acknowledged repeatedly in interviews that the door to mainstream network television has remained firmly closed to her, regardless of any apology or explanation she's offered. The connection between her and network television was severed. Number 12. Bill Cosby. The beloved figure whose legacy was poisoned. For decades, Bill Cosby was one of the most beloved and trusted figures in American television. First through his genuinely groundbreaking work on I Spy in the 1960s, later as the star and creative force behind The Cosby Show, one of the most successful sitcoms of the entire 1980s. Starting in 2014, dozens of women came forward publicly. Allegations that Cosby had drugged and sexually assaulted them, allegations spanning several decades. Not one accusation, not two, dozens. Well over 60 by some counts, spanning allegations from as far back as the 1960s through the 2000s. Networks, streaming services, and syndication partners moved quickly to distance themselves. They pulled reruns of his shows. They cancelled projects that had been in development. They removed him from their infrastructure. In 2018, Cosby was convicted on charges related to one of the assault allegations. The conviction was later overturned on a legal technicality in 2021. Not because the underlying allegations were proven false, but because of a procedural violation. Despite the overturned conviction, Cosby remained effectively frozen out of mainstream television. No major network or streaming platform showed any indication whatsoever of working with him again. The sheer volume of women who came forward, the pattern itself, made the case one of the most extensively documented patterns of alleged predatory behavior attributed to a single American entertainer. Networks that once eagerly courted him for reunion specials and anniversary retrospectives have shown no sign of revisiting that relationship, regardless of the legal technicality. Number 13. Paula Deen. The brand that collapsed overnight. Paula Deen built an enormously popular cooking empire around Southern comfort food recipes. She was one of Food Network's biggest stars, ubiquitous on daytime television for over a decade. Cookbook deals, restaurant ventures, endorsement deals with major brands. In 2013, during a deposition connected to an employment discrimination lawsuit filed by a former employee, Deen admitted under oath to having used a racial slur in the past. She acknowledged other racially insensitive comments and jokes made over the years. When the deposition became public, the Food Network announced it would not renew her contract. That single announcement triggered a cascade. Several other corporate partners quickly cut ties. Retail chains pulled entire lines of branded cookware and food products from store shelves within days of the deposition becoming public. At the height of her fame, Deen had built a business empire worth well over $100 million. Restaurants, cookware, product endorsements, television shows, a decade of careful, steady brand growth. Within days of that deposition becoming public, it collapsed. She attempted a comeback in the years that followed, independently produced content, smaller platforms, but never returned to anything resembling her previous level of major network visibility. Her once ubiquitous television presence reduced almost overnight to a cautionary tale about what a single deposition could do to a media empire. About how quickly a business built over more than a decade could unravel once a single piece of sworn testimony becomes public knowledge. Number 14. Bill O'Reilly. The cable news giant, toppled by settlements. Bill O'Reilly hosted The O'Reilly Factor for over 20 years. It was consistently the highest-rated program on Fox News. That wasn't a close competition. It dominated. O'Reilly himself became one of the most recognizable and influential figures in American cable news. In April of 2017, an investigation by the New York Times revealed that O'Reilly and Fox News had paid out approximately $13 million over the years to settle multiple sexual harassment claims made against him by former colleagues. $13 million. Not alleged, not disputed, paid. Within weeks of the report, more than 50 advertisers pulled their commercials from his show. On April 19, 2017, Fox News announced that O'Reilly would not be returning to the network. The decision came even though his show remained one of the network's top performers right up until his departure. A clear signal that the financial and reputational fallout from the settlements had simply become too expensive for the network to continue absorbing. O'Reilly has continued producing content independently since his firing, but has never again anchored a program on a major cable news network. He's released books and independent video content through his own website, maintaining a loyal following. Nothing close, though, to the nightly audience of several million viewers he commanded during his 2 decades as Fox's biggest star. A genuinely steep drop from the position he'd held. Number 15. O.J. Simpson. The name that became industry shorthand for untouchable. O.J. Simpson built a broadcasting career as an NFL analyst and occasional actor long before his 1994 arrest for the murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. The trial that followed became one of the most heavily televised trials in American history. Simpson was acquitted in the criminal trial. Legally, he was cleared. Following his acquittal, his broadcasting and acting opportunities effectively dried up. Major networks were unwilling to associate with him, regardless of the verdict. The clearest example came in 2006, when Fox planned to air a television special and accompanying book titled If I Did It, in which Simpson described, in hypothetical terms, how he might have carried out the killings. Pure speculation, imaginative exercise. The public backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Numerous local Fox affiliates announced they would refuse to air the special, regardless of what the network decided. A level of open affiliate revolt against a network's own programming decision remains genuinely rare in the history of American broadcast television. Within days, News Corporation chairman Rupert Murdoch personally cancelled both the special and the book, calling the entire project ill-considered. The special did eventually air more than a decade later, in 2018, reframed explicitly as a confession rather than a hypothetical. By then, Simpson had spent over a decade as one of the most thoroughly blacklisted figures in the history of American broadcasting. Between his acquittal and his eventual arrest on unrelated armed robbery charges in 2007, Simpson attempted various minor media projects and public appearances. Almost all of them drew immediate public backlash and swift cancellation. The pattern repeated so consistently that by the final years of his life, his name had become something close to industry shorthand for a performer no legitimate broadcaster would ever risk touching again. 15 different stars, 15 different decades, 15 completely different reasons why a network ultimately decided a performer simply wasn't worth the risk anymore. Some of these bans came down to a single reckless comment. Others were the result of years of mounting political tension. Others still involved allegations so serious that no amount of past popularity could outweigh them. A couple of these stories, particularly Nat King Cole's, aren't really about anyone getting banned in the traditional sense. They're about an entire industry too afraid of public backlash to keep supporting someone who deserved far better than what he actually received. What all 15 ultimately share is proof of something television would rather you didn't think too carefully about. No amount of ratings, awards, or decades of built-up goodwill has ever been enough to guarantee a permanent place on American television once a network decided the cost of keeping someone on air had finally outweighed the benefit of having them there. A few of these stars eventually found their way back, at least partially, through smaller platforms, independent projects, or in Joan Rivers' case, a genuinely full and celebrated return decades later. Others never really did. Their names quietly retired from network consideration entirely. Either way, these 15 stories are a reminder that television has never actually been the stable, predictable business it likes to present itself as. The same audience capable of making someone a household name has proven just as capable of deciding when that name simply wasn't welcome anymore. If you've found this interesting, if you want more stories about the hidden machinery of entertainment, the decisions that shaped what we saw and what we didn't, do hit that subscribe button, because there are a lot more stories where these came from. Thanks for watching.